futurist manifesto of lust, no less. Here again, she's very much part of the French avant-garde. This is Baudelaire, this is Apollinaire, this is the new art, this is the celebration of the discovery of the body as the most appropriate way of celebrating the collapse of traditional Catholicism. And of course, in the background, there are people like Freud, Adler, Melanie Klein, and a whole army of psychoanalytic thinkers who are proposing, again in this quasi-Darwinian way, that essentially the basic motivation of human beings is eros. And for her, we suffocate that at the price of our humanity. Lust is the expression of a being projected beyond itself. It is the painful joy of wounded flesh, the joyous pain of a flowering. And whatever secrets unite these beings, it is a union of flesh. It is the sensory and sensual synthesis that leads to the greatest liberation of spirit. It is the communion of a particle of humanity with all the sensuality of the earth. Art and war are the great manifestations of sensuality. Lust is their flower. A people exclusively spiritual or a people exclusively carnal will be condemned to the same decadence, sterility. Christian morality alone, following on from pagan morality, was fatally drawn to consider lust as a weakness. Out of the healthy joy which is the flowering of the flesh in all its power, it has made something shameful and to be hidden, a vice to be denied. It has covered it with hypocrisy, and this has made a sin of it. We must strip lust of all the sentimental veils that disfigure it. These veils were thrown over it out of mere cowardice, because smug sentimentality is so satisfying. Sentimentality is comfortable and therefore demeaning. Well, you can imagine that these manifestos, which were printed and reprinted, were quite a sensation in left bank avant-garde Paris at the time. And it's also quite easy to see how they fit in, at least with the cutting a wave of a certain type of war against what was understood to be traditional Christianity. She is not interested in having a job. She is not interested in earning a living. She has her own emolument from her family. She inherits. She marries twice, divorces twice, and she holds court in a very French Parisian environment of a salon in her home in the 16th arrondissement, and everybody goes, not just Apollinaire and Rodin, but the people who are then going to move into the Dada movement. Braque goes along, and so on. In this context, she publishes her poems, Poèmes de la mer et du soleil, Les poèmes d'orgueil, and so forth. And then the critical thing happens. Like a lot of people in her time, she becomes interested in something called Mediterraneanism, an ungainly word. We've never really had anything quite like that in English. Mediterraneanism comes from the particular French sense of being pulled between two poles, the north and the south. Are the French the descendants of the Germanic Franks, and therefore connected to Northern Europe's linear narrative of progress and science and self-possession, the stiff upper lip? Is that what has made France great in her imperial and scientific accomplishments? Or alternatively, is France Latin? Is it of the south? Is it truly Mediterranean? Warm, languorous, hospitable, inefficient, but spiritual. And she always uses the word spiritual in the vaguest possible sense. She comes to the view that actually the correct way of breaking with the deadening machine age is to turn towards the Mediterranean, turn towards the sun, which is hence all of these poems that she's writing about the sun. The sun for her, as for many others, is a symbol of light and of warmth. The more you move away from it, the more you come into the spiritual, artistic, human death of Northern Europe, with its negation of virility and femininity, its negation of authentic humanity. Like many other people who are thinking along the same lines, she decides to experience this, le soleil, for herself, and she goes to Morocco. And you think of all the others who went to North Africa, Gide, who went to Biskra, Isabel Eberhard, who went just about everywhere. various writers before or since who went to Morocco, Matisse. She goes to Morocco with a friend of hers and tours the south, where she finds, to her great excitement, what she takes to be the actual lived experience that in her Paris arrondissement she has only been, in a utopian sense, dreaming about. Here she finds men who are truly men. Here she finds women who are truly women. Here she finds an authenticity, a genuine connection of earth and heaven, of tradition and the present, a genuine belongingness to the land, to the elements, to sexuality itself, that looks to her like what she's been looking for in Paris, but in the north was never able to find. It's an extraordinary transformation for her. What happens next is the First World War, and this is really the great watershed in her life. At the outset, she's still a futurist. She believes in war, she believes in machinery, she thinks that this is the war that's going to destroy the old class system, that's going to destroy the ancient fossilized bourgeois conventions that are barring human beings from experiencing their authenticity. Of course, she's a woman, she can't join up, but she drives an ambulance and puts on a nurse's uniform, and for several years is involved in tending the wounded. The white-hot enthusiasm for the war of 1914 gradually, after the Battle of the Marne and the horrors of the trenches, turns to a certain disillusionment in her and in her contemporaries, and an extraordinary crisis of futurist faith ensues. She's not sure what to do about the reality of the suffering that she is seeing all the time. The cripples on the streets of Paris, the economic catastrophe, the human misery, the disillusionment with the whole scientific patriotic project. So, to run away from it, she goes first of all to Spain, where she stays with her friend Picabia, the artist. And then she goes off to America, where she makes a name for herself in the same sort of avant-garde artistic circles in New York. She has, as what she takes to be, her supreme art form, something that she calls métagorie. Her view is that Western sensibility is academicized and has fragmented the human and artistic experience. Music is one discipline, theatre is another discipline, dance is something else, poetry is something else, architecture is something else. That's emblematic of the fragmented condition of the Enlightenment mind. She wants to bring them all together, and this seems to be what she's up to with this idea of métagorie. And the Metropolitan Opera in New York is one of the places where she puts on these festivals. And she's a dancer, she herself performs. Her idea, as she expresses it, is to reintegrate the human personality to a triumphant affirmation of gender, sexuality, the body, with all of the other arts of music, chant, poetry. So the thing is a kind of festival of everything. There are images, there is dance, there is music, everything is there on stage. The New York critics were sympathetic, but the audiences were a little baffled by this very avant-garde performance. She's a student of Diaghilev and Stravinsky, and New York is not quite there yet. But she says, still, New York is the ideal city of the future because it's a cubist city. She's still excited by its modernity, by its rejection of the past. But probably because artistically she just can't find a niche for herself, she goes back to Paris. And Paris, she finds, is in the grip of a fundamental collapse in faith. People no longer believe in futurism because they can't see a future for themselves. This is the world that has been shattered, imperial myth, the nationalist idols, even the optimism of social Darwinists like Durkheim and many others has been shipwrecked on the rock of the horrors of the Western Front. Futurism comes to an abrupt end. It's replaced by various forms of nihilism, Dada being the most obvious example, or at least explorations of the human essence as being not an ideal, but as the representation of the turbulences of lower egotistic forces in the lower dungeons of the human psyche, surrealism being an expression of that. Freud as the ultimate determiner of the human condition, not some idealistic notion of the human becoming, the enlightenment, reasonable man, but as an ultimately selfish and indeed even demonic creature.